With surplus food came the ability to support more people, necessitating newer, larger political structures. The Pacific Northwest became one of the most densely populated regions of North America. There, a unique social organization centered on elaborate feasts, called potlatches, developed. These potlatches celebrated births and weddings and determined social status. Hosts demonstrated their wealth and power by entertaining guests with food, artwork, and performances. The more the hosts gave away, the more prestige and power they had within the group. Some would save for decades to host an extravagant potlatch that would, in turn, give them greater respect and power within the community. Potlatches also served as a vehicle for political activity. Tlingit potlatches, for instance, can be understood as a way of managing conflicts, including competing land and resource claims, the selection of clan leaders, the establishment and reaffirmation of alliances, and resolving individual disputes. With developments in agricultural technology came the ability and need for the centralization of large numbers of people. Agriculture flourished in the fertile river valleys between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean, an area known as the Eastern Woodlands, as well as irrigated areas of the Southwest. The hands required to maintain these crops were many, and some groups, such as the large population at Cahokia, a massive city in the Mississippi River Valley, relied on coerced labor made possible through extended empires. For others, food security enabled them to pursue artistic, administrative, and spiritual activities. It also enabled the growth of large advanced early societies, such as that at Tenochtitlan in the Valley of Mexico, Cahokia along the Mississippi River, and ancestral Puebloan communities in the desert oasis areas of the greater Southwest. Maize arrived in the U.S. Southwest from different parts of Mexico about 3,200 years ago, carried by travelers and by exchanging seeds along trade networks. It spread from there across the Great Plains to the eastern half of the continent over 2,000 years ago, reaching the far north about 1,000 years later. Corn, however, did not become a dominant food source right away, but as a highly nutritious food, it continues to hold an important spiritual and cultural place in many native communities. Hopi stories, for example, tell of Muingwu, the Kachina spirit, who grew corn from his body, along with watermelon and squash. Quiche Maya recount that the maize god, Hunhunapu, mixed corn and water together to create the first humans. Penobscot stories explain that corn is a gift from the body of First Mother. One of the largest of these corn-supported cities was Teotihuacan in current-day central Mexico, northeast of Mexico City. This community, which had a population of at least 25,000 people, and likely more, was made up of neighborhoods populated by ethnically distinct groups of people who came from across Mesoamerica. One of the earliest influences of the socio-political integration of the Mesoamerican culture was the previously mentioned Olmec. The architecture in Teotihuacan included large pyramids, especially the pyramids of the sun and moon. Later Nahuatl-speaking peoples in Mexico, including the Aztecs and Toltecs, considered Teotihuacan the birthplace of the gods. After the long and slow fall of Teotihuacan, the Toltec rose to power, acquiring many skills from its descendants, including woven textiles, architecture, and astronomy. Buildings, sculptures, markets, libraries, and universities populated the Toltec cities. The Toltec continued a highly centralized, theocratic government, but the palace held more power than the temple. The extensive and rapid development of Toltec cities was made possible by a rather stable government based on the control of water. In the Southwest, about 2,500 years ago, ancestors of current-day Pueblo people, sometimes called Hohokam or Huhugam, invented sophisticated irrigation systems to raise crops in the desert near current-day Phoenix, Arizona. The canals they built with clay and digging sticks routed river water into their gardens, irrigating cotton fields as well as the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. The canal system was more than 800 miles of trunk lines, with hundreds of miles of branches. The longest known canal measured 20 miles. From 2,900 to 1,500 years ago, in the area now known as the Fraser River Valley of British Columbia, ancestors of Stowe, low-coast Salish peoples lived on salmon, elk, and shellfish, as well as whales, seals, and sea otters that they hunted with hooks and harpoons from large canoes of red cedar. Indeed, many people of the Pacific Northwest built elaborate plank houses out of the region's abundant cedar trees. The 500-foot-long Suquamish Ullman House, or Old Man House, for instance, rested on the banks of Puget Sound. Giant cedar trees were also carved and painted in the shape of animals or other figures to tell stories and express identities. These poles, later called totem poles by anthropologists, became the most recognizable art form of the Pacific Northwest, but people also carved masks and other wooden items, such as hand drums and rattles, out of the region's great trees. As communities across North America were connected by kin, politics, and culture, and sustained by long-distance trading routes. The Mississippi River, for example, served as an important trade artery, but all of the continent's waterways were vital to transportation and communication. The community at Poverty Point, in what is currently Louisiana, had access to copper from present-day Canada and flint from modern-day Indiana. Sheets of mica found at the sacred Serpent Mound site near the Ohio River came from the Allegheny Mountains in the northeast, and obsidian from nearby earthworks originated from the Yellowstone River area near present-day Montana. Turquoise from the greater Southwest could be found further south at Teotihuacan. In the Southwest, ancestral Puebloan people, the Anasazi, sometimes referred to as basket makers, adapted to a wetter climate by growing corn and using the regional grasses to create beautifully woven baskets, mats, and sandals. They lived in the desert lowlands, largely in homes made of wood and adobe. Sophisticated irrigation practices, agriculture, extensive trading networks, and the domestication of animals like dogs and turkeys supported an expanding population. Earlier, Puebloan communities lived on the lowlands and built their homes on wooden posts. As the climate warmed, however, more people began moving to the nearby mesas to escape the heat. As the climate dried out, many people followed the pinyon trees and animals to find water for their crops and communities. In the highlands, communities switched from living in wooden pit houses to structures made of quarried stone embedded into cliffs, such as those at Chaco Canyon in present-day New Mexico. Some of these residential structures were massive, such as Pueblo Bonito, which housed hundreds of Puebloan people, stretched over 2 acres, and rose 5 stories high. Copper bells, turquoise decorations, and bright macaw feathers decorated its 600 rooms. Homes like those at Pueblo Bonito included a small dugout room, or kiva, which played an important role in a variety of ceremonies and served as the center for Puebloan life and culture. Additionally, Puebloan people carefully charted the stars and designed their homes in line with the path of the sun and moon. Between 900 and 1300 CE, as many as 15,000 Pueblo people lived in the Chaco Canyon complex. These individuals constructed intricate road systems spanning hundreds of miles that would connect communities and trade routes across the region. Chaco Canyon inhabitants appear to have faced several ecological challenges, including a severe drought in 1130 CE that ultimately caused them to disperse into smaller settlements. However, Chaco remains a site of spiritual and cultural importance. Similarly, in the Pacific Northwest, a persistent drought provoked change. And not just in terms of increased risk of forest fire, less rain meant that salmon yields would be less predictable. These changes nudged networks away from rivers and toward overland trail systems. Root crops, especially camas bulbs, became particularly important in Salish communities as winter food. Camas prairies were tended and harvested with care, followed by ceremony in the springtime. The prairies themselves were host to important medicine and edible plants. Frequent fires increased the availability of wildlife, berries, and other wild foods and medicines. The same arid climate system affected the Mississippian peoples of the American Midwest and Southeast. Roughly 1,000 years ago, the largest Mississippian settlement, Cahokia, located just east of modern-day St. Louis, peaked at a population of perhaps as many as 30,000 people. It rivaled contemporary European cities in size. No city north of modern Mexico, in fact, would match Cahokia's peak population levels until after the American Revolution. The city itself spanned 2,000 acres. The center was marked by what is known today as Monk's Mound, a large earthen hill that rose 10 stories high. Its base was larger than that of the pyramids in Egypt. Scholars believe that, as with many of the peoples who lived in the eastern woodlands, life and death in Cahokia was linked to the movement of the stars, sun, and moon, and their ceremonial earthwork structures reflected these important structuring forces. They were also places of important economic exchange and political intrigue. Cahokia became a key trading center, partly because of its position near the Mississippi, Illinois, and Missouri rivers. These rivers created networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the American Southeast. Archaeologists have identified materials such as seashells that traveled over 1,000 miles to reach the center of this civilization. Cahokia hummed with the sounds of thousands upon thousands of pilgrims, traders, warriors, and settlers. Corn was one of the factors that enabled such a large community to exist, even though its cultivation often depended on people who had been subjugated in warfare. The size of Cahokia and extent of its influence suggests that the city relied on a hierarchical system of chiefdoms and tributaries, enabled by sustained social stratification and frequent warfare. War captives were seized, forming an important part of the economy in the North American Southeast. Unlike the later transatlantic slave trade, Native American slavery was not based on holding people as property, nor was it always a permanent condition. Instead, Native Americans understood the enslaved as people who lacked kinship networks. Very often, a formerly enslaved person could become a fully integrated member of the community. Therefore, adoption or marriage could enable an enslaved person to enter a kinship network and join the community. Indeed, slavery and captive trading became an important way that many Native communities grew and gained or maintained power in many areas of the continent. Around 1050 CE, Cahokia's population expanded exponentially by almost 500% in one generation. Moreover, new groups of incoming peoples were absorbed into the city and its supporting communities. But by 1300 CE, the once powerful city collapsed. Scholars previously pointed to ecological disaster or slow depopulation through emigration, but new research into the causes of the city's decline instead emphasized mounting warfare, indicated by defensive stockades, or perhaps internal political tensions made worse by environmental changes. After its decline, the successor states to Cahokia restructured as small tribal republics. People influenced by Cahokia are often called Mississippian, and their ways of living profoundly shaped southeastern societies. Historians suggest that Cahokian evangelists and emissaries spread news of their new religious beliefs and practices, including the specialization of labor and architectural styles. The people along the Black Warrior River, for example, renovated their city, including elements of Mississippian architecture such as pyramids and a large central plaza. Labor and agricultural practices, in particular, aided communities struggling to feed and house their inhabitants. Later, smaller communities sent their young people to learn from villagers on the Black Warrior River. In this way, the culture of Cahokia would endure. For example, the Lady of Cofutacheki ruled over a Mississippian community in the lands between the future Carolinas and the lower Mississippi River, where Spanish settlers encountered her in 1540. Politically and socially, Mississippians were organized into chiefdoms. Chiefs, usually male, inherited their authority through maternal bloodlines. Traditionally matrilineal, Mississippian women were empowered by their control over agricultural food production. Historian Christina Snyder suggests that the Lady of Cofutacheki may have risen to power due to a lack of a legitimate male heir after deaths from a recent widespread disease. The lady's power stemmed from her authority over access to the kingdom's food, trade, and weapons, and the support of her people, which allowed her to make decisions and alliances for the kingdom. Some of the largest and most concentrated populations in North America 2,000 years ago were the Puebloan groups, centered in the current-day U.S. southwest and northwestern Mexico, the Mississippian groups living along the Great River and its tributaries, and the Mesoamerican groups of the areas now known as Central America, Central Mexico, and the Yucatan. In present-day northern Guatemala and the Mexican state of Tabasco, the Maya built the city-states of Chichen Itza, Mayapan, and Uxmal, which housed massive temples and sustained large populations. There, a combined priesthood and nobility governed the rest of the population. In the further reaches of Maya territory, ordinary villages retained clan structures, where they worked the nobles' fields, paid rent for land use, and contributed labor and taxes for the construction of roads, nobles' houses, and other structures. Ultimately, the Maya constructed a complex and long-lasting civilization, with written language, advanced mathematics, and stunningly accurate calendars. Section 6. Continuities. By the turn of the first millennium, 1,000 years ago, most native North American people in what is now the United States lived in small communities tied by kinship networks. The Cherokee, for example, emerged after the Mississippian mound-building period, reflecting a shift in political economy and social organization away from the more seemingly urban and hierarchical mode illustrated by Cahokia. The Cherokee and many other communities understood four-legged and two-legged creatures as their relatives, and some communities adopted clan or band systems as ways of organizing families across space, time, and species, and dividing social roles and responsibilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that ancestors living at Poverty Point in what is now Louisiana likely possessed a highly organized political society, despite the fact that they did not practice agriculture. This hypothesis about political authority is based upon the required planning and construction needed to create the expansive amphitheater found there. Its construction employed very sophisticated mathematics and skilled labor. Poverty Point challenges interpretations that suggest native societies were organized in only two ways: advanced, complex hierarchical civilizations made possible by highly productive farming, or less complex ones with chiefs and a council, as seen in hunter/foraging people. Some communities trace their ancestry through their mothers or were matrilineal, including the Gitxsan and Cherokee. In these cases, biological fathers often joined the mother's extended families. Sometimes a mother's brothers, the child's uncles, took on more direct roles in child raising than biological fathers. Mothers often wielded enormous influence at local levels, and men's identities and influence often depended on their relationships to women. Indigenous societies, meanwhile, generally afforded greater sexual and marital freedom than European cultures. Women, for instance, often chose their husbands, and divorce was often a relatively straightforward process. Many indigenous groups across the continent used shifting cultivation, in which farmers cut the forest, burned the undergrowth, and then planted seeds in the nutrient-rich ashes. When crop yields began to decline, farmers moved to another field and allowed the land to recover and the forest to regrow before again cutting the forest, burning the undergrowth, and restarting the cycle. In eastern woodland areas, from the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast, indigenous communities managed their forest resources by burning underbrush to create vast park-like hunting grounds. Fire management was especially important to clear the ground for planting the Three Sisters crops of corn, beans, and squash. These three crops together supplied most of the energy, fiber, vitamins, and minerals that humans need. When planted in small, raised hills, corn provides support for bean vines to grow upward. The bean plants provide nitrogen in the soil for corn, while squash gathers water with its broad leaves and provides shade to keep the soil protected. In this region, the rich soil and use of specialized tools enabled effective and sustainable farming practices, producing high yields without overburdening the soil. Assuring food security in this region was a gender and age-specific responsibility. Women held power in many ways, including reproduction and also their authority over the earth's fertility through agriculture. Gender work roles were more flexible and equitable than those practiced by Europeans. One Hidatsa woman described how her father helped her mother in caring for the children. Similarly, Luther Standing Bear recalled that if a man was home from hunting for a few days, he, quote, busied himself in many ways, lightening the work of the woman. Indigenous men and women were partners who cared for one another and worked together for the good of the family. Anthropologist Eleanor Leacock explains, nothing in the structure of egalitarian band societies necessitated special deference to men. There were no economic and social liabilities that bound women to be more sensitive to men's needs and feelings than vice versa. Women engaged in permanent, intensive agriculture, using hand tools like hoes, adzes, and diggers. Children and the elderly also had roles in collecting wild foods and medicines from the land. And while adult men usually hunted and fished, big game hunting, such as for bison or caribou, was a social and ritualistic event that relied on the talents of most of the community working together and respected the death of the hunted. Women took part by cleaning and curing hides, which became their property. Generally, spiritual practices, understandings of property, and political arrangements differed markedly from European ways. Spiritual power permeated their worlds in tangible and accessible ways. Some indigenous people believed that all living things contained a spirit. In many cases, this power could be appealed to and harnessed through ceremony, song, or dance. Indigenous religions were often also inclusivist. That is, they allowed individuals to incorporate new religious beliefs or practices to understand the changing world. And continued to be complex. Before colonization, Eastern woodland societies were more democratic than their European counterparts. Traditionally, any adult, male or female, was able to speak at council meetings. In most instances, the government included a chief and a tribal council that worked together to govern and guide their communities. Chiefs were respected people chosen by their communities based on their demonstrated leadership and wisdom. They offered guidance and helped resolve disputes, but even the most powerful rulers of the Eastern woodlands did not operate like kings. Councils continue to include elected members of the tribe who advocate for their people and pass laws to govern their nation. Indigenous communities usually valued group autonomy over individual interests. The system of decision-making was based on consensus instead of majority rule. However, when an agreement could not be reached, the dissenters would leave the community, forming one of their own nearby. Other communities, like that at Cahokia or in Tenochtitlan, had more hierarchical and less democratic governments. Coastal foraging societies in the Northwest were also less democratic, resembling feudal Europe with ruling nobles and a hereditary ranking system. Commoners provided labor in these quote-quote-ly societies. Alternatively, the Muskogees, Creeks, and Seminoles had three branches of government, each led by the community's elite clans: the military, civil administration, and the branch that handled sacred rituals. Typically, women were not involved in leadership affairs within these communities. However, women of the Haudenosaunee and Cherokee held more political authority. Among the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and Tuscaroras, certain women would choose their male council representatives for the clan. Clan mothers among the Haudenosaunee would select chiefs, determine farming rights, adjudicate legal disputes, and wield other forms of power in the community. Various land systems existed in indigenous communities. However, generally, Native Americans saw land as a resource individuals had the right to use, not as a commodity to be owned, bought, and sold. As leadership varied in Native communities, they were typically judged by how well they could provide for their people. Generosity was valued in leadership, and extreme starvation was mostly avoided. For example, Powhatan, an indigenous ruler in what is now Virginia, was known for his generosity and would redistribute 90% of his collected resources, paying specific attention to the neediest among his people. Knowledge in Native communities was communicated in many ways. For example, Ojibways used birch bark scrolls to record medical treatments, recipes, songs, stories, and more. Other eastern woodland peoples wove plant fibers, embroidered skins with porcupine quills, and modeled the earth to make sites of complex ceremonial meaning. On the plains, artisans wove buffalo hair and painted on buffalo skins. In the Pacific Northwest, artisans carved great cedar poles and decorated large wooden houses. Maya, Zapotec, and Nahua ancestors in Mesoamerica painted their histories on plant-derived textiles or hides and carved them into stone. Quipu technology was developed between 600 CE and 1000 CE in central Peru. It was a knotted string device recording various histories and constructed in binary code that remains unbroken to this day. Only 600 Quipu pieces remain today, as most were destroyed by Spanish colonists. According to their histories, the ancestors of the Nahua people moved into the Valley of Mexico from their homeland of Aztlan in the north around 1100 CE. Soon, other Nahua ancestral groups founded small city-states known as Altepetl. The related Mexica group founded their Altepetl, Tenochtitlan, on an island in the middle of the lake in current-day Mexico City in 1325. Almost 100 years later, in 1427, Tenochtitlan, with the three Altepetl Texcoco, Tlacopan, and Huexotzinco, went to war and conquered its former ally, the Tepaneca Altepetl of Azcapotzalco. The victors consolidated their power into the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, also known as the Aztec Empire. The Aztec state depended on irrigated agriculture, with corn as its main focus, along with beans, pumpkins, cacao, tomatoes, tobacco, cotton, and other crops, for their dense population. They constructed dams, canals, and fortress structures made of stone. Tenochtitlan had elaborate markets and received raw goods from all areas of the Americas. Turquoise from the pueblos in the U.S. Southwest was used as a means of exchange for valuable commodities. This arrangement of related peoples went on to dominate first the Valley of Mexico, exacting tribute from enemy and vassal populations alike. The Triple Alliance ruled through a decentralized network of subject peoples that paid regular tribute, including everything from corn and other foodstuffs to luxury goods such as jade, cacao, and gold, and provided troops and captives for the empire. Triple Alliance forces would spread to the Gulf Coast and as far south as current-day Honduras, exacting tribute and erecting Mexica-style guns, architecture, and other cultural monuments along the way. In Tenochtitlan, a massive pyramid temple, the Templo Mayor, was located at the city center. Its ruins can still be found in the center of Mexico City today, a testament to Mexica power. This was also a time of severe drought and famine. The ruler of Texcoco Altepetl, Nezahualcoyotl, 1402 to 1472, helped solve the problem of drought and famine by building a massive aqueduct and irrigation system for Texcoco and allied Tenochtitlan, then ruled by Moctezuma I, ca. 1398 to 1469. Much of the city of Tenochtitlan was fed by crops grown on large artificial islands called chinampas, constructed by dredging mud and rich sediment from the bottom of the lake and depositing it over time to form plots of land. Additionally, massive marketplaces facilitated the movement of local and faraway goods. By the time Moctezuma II Xochiyotzin, ca. 1466 to 1520, came to lead the Triple Alliance in 1502, Tenochtitlan's Mexica, also known as the Aztecs, were the dominant military and economic power in the region. In the eastern woodlands to the north, many Native American societies lived in smaller, dispersed communities to take advantage of rich soils and abundant rivers and streams. Along the St. Lawrence River, Iroquoian-speaking Wendat and Haudenosaunee peoples lived near Anishinaabeg and Innu communities, and their kinship and trade ties stretched from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes and onto the Mississippi River. Lenape people farmed the bottomlands throughout the Hudson and Delaware River watersheds in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. During planting and harvesting seasons, they gathered in larger groups to coordinate their labor and take advantage of local abundance. As proficient fishers, they organized seasonal fish camps and wove nets, baskets, mats, and a variety of household materials from the rushes found along the streams, rivers, and coasts. Dispersed and relatively independent, hundreds of Lenape settlements were nonetheless bound together by oral histories, ceremonial traditions, consensus-based political organization, kinship networks, and a shared clan system. Marriage occurred between clans, and matrilineal lines organized the society. For example, a married man would join the clan of his wife. Additionally, Lenape women wielded authority over marriages, households, agricultural production, and the selection of leaders called sachems. Sachems governed Lenape communities by the consent of their people and acquired their authority by demonstrating wisdom and experience. Large gatherings occurred for ceremonial purposes or to make important decisions, and the sachems spoke for their people in councils that included men, women, and elders. Between 600 to 1,000 years ago, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, from the region now called New York and Ontario, developed the political system they still hold today. It was created out of the necessity to end war and broker peace. With droughts, competing tributary systems, and other challenges, many indigenous people of the Northeast and Great Lakes found themselves at war both within their own and against other groups. During this time, a man later called the Peacemaker, who had been born north of Lake Ontario and raised by his mother and grandmother, crossed the lands to spread his message of peace and his system for ending wars. The first person who supported Peacemaker was a woman from the Erie Nation called Jiganhase. She gave Peacemaker lodging and food and pledged to help him spread peace. Another person, a man from the Onondaga Nation called Hiawatha, became Peacemaker's spokesperson. Eventually, Peacemaker gathered leaders from all 5 Haudenosaunee families, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and invited them to join the Great League of Peace. At that time, the nations were divided into small hereditary sachemdoms, but the Great League would be represented centrally by 50 sachems, chosen by the traditional clan mothers. But one tyrannical leader from Onondaga, Tadadaho, initially refused, but with the help of Jiganhase and Hiawatha, Tadadaho agreed to join the League. Peacemaker promised that he would henceforth preside over the council, and that the ceremonial fire would always be kept at Onondaga. Then, Peacemaker uprooted a white pine tree and called on everyone to bury their weapons beneath its roots. The white pine's branches came to symbolize the branches of peace, which would shelter any nation that joined the League. Later, the founders of the U.S. government would be inspired by the Haudenosaunee League and its federal system when they built their own nation. In the 19th century, the League would expand to include the Tuscaroras, Section 8. Conclusion. The Americas have been filled with a diverse and dynamic array of communities for millennia. The arrival of Europeans 5 centuries ago dramatically altered the political economy of North America. The resulting global exchange of people, animals, plants, and microbes, what some scholars benignly call the Columbian Exchange, disrupted long-standing structures of power and belonging, inaugurated centuries of violence, unleashed biological terror, and revolutionized the history of the world. However, these actions began the second, not the first, chapter in the long American Yawp.